please join me in giving Mr. Jerry Wallace a warm Pachyderm welcome.
Things are now looking up for Mr. Coolidge, who was consigned years and years ago to the dustbin of history by liberal historians. The fact that I'm standing here today before you speaking about him is proof of that. Historians began to give Coolidge a fresh look in 1995. There was a Coolidge conference in Washington sponsored by the Library of Congress, and the library put up its excellent website, which is still available today to you, by the way, on prosperity and thrift in the Coolidge era, which is stuffed full of informative documents and interesting photos. Then there was a second conference in 1998 at the JFK Presidential Library in Boston, and another in the same venue just recently in 2010. All these activities generated a considerable scholarly interest in Coolidge. If you want, and some folks do this, you can go back even further for a Coolidge awakening to 1981, when incoming President Ronald Reagan, a great Coolidge fan, hung the portrait of the 30th president in the cabinet room, an act that engendered a great deal of discussion in the media at the time. That was followed in 1982 by the publication of Thomas B. Silver's Coolidge and the Historians, a powerful indictment of the shoddy historical treatment given Coolidge in his presidency. Quite a volume that book was, and it's still available. I recommend it to you. For pointing out the errors of the likes of Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Silvers was shunned and denounced by the historical community and truly became a martyr to the Coolidge cause. Most recently, perhaps an encouraging interest in Calvin Coolidge was the publication in 1998 of two fine scholarly biographies. Dr. Robert Farrell, who's known as the presidential historian par excellence, did his The Presidency of Calvin Coolidge. And Dr. Robert Sobel, he was for years the historian for the Wall Street Journal and for Barron's. He wrote a lot for Barron's. Did his Coolidge, An American Enigma. These two volumes did much to create new interest in and discussion about Coolidge, his administration, and his great decade, the 1920s. More recently, interest in Coolidge has dramatically increased as a result of the Great Recession, which has encouraged much debate concerning the proper response of government to an economic slump. Should it be a vigorous response using all the tools at hand, or a restrained one, such as favored by Coolidge, in which government seeks to get its own fiscal house in order while the economy is allowed to right itself? Also, with current ballooning growth in the federal debt and arguments concerning proper tax policy, there has been a new focus on Coolidge's amazing success as president in reducing the national debt and in lowering tax rates while simultaneously bringing into the Treasury more revenue, an approach that fostered a notable period of unprecedented economic growth and prosperity in the land. These matters and much more have been masterly addressed in Amity Slay's outstanding biography, Coolidge, published just a year ago in February. This well-researched and finely written volume offers a truly fresh view of Coolidge, the man, the politician and statesman, and his presidency. It is my belief that Miss Slay's has smashed once and for all that old stereotypical image of Calvin Coolidge, the old sourpuss, tight-fisted, do-nothing president, put out by New Deal historians and their liberal academic successors. Well, now let me get into my main topic here on Mr. Coolidge and give you a little biographical information on the man. He was born on the 4th of July in the year of 1872 in the 96th year of the independence of the United States in Plymouth Notch, Vermont. Coolidge's father, a highly regarded man, was a farmer, a businessman, and a local politician. Through his father's line, Coolidge inherited a few drops of Indian blood, something he liked to note. And by the way, it was under the Coolidge administration that all Indians were made citizens of the United States, and the act passed in 1925. Also, the Coolidge administration sponsored a study of Indian conditions called the Merriman Report. It was done in a rather unusual way. They were afraid that the Bureau of Indian Affairs would not do a decent study, that it would be biased and prejudiced. They went out and got a private group, the Brookings Institute, to do the study for them so they'd have an impartial study. That report was something like 800 pages. It was the first major study of Indian conditions in the United States for over 50 years, I believe. I've forgotten the exact number of years. But it was a very profound thing and recommended many reforms in terms of health care, education, and so forth as concerns Native Americans. That study is rarely mentioned anymore, but it was a profound document, and it paved and laid the foundations for much of the reforms that came later. Coolidge's key goal for Indians was the integration of Indians into the American society, and that was the principal thrust of it. But anyway, it was a very fine report, and it's something that is often forgotten, so I toss that out now. He was also proud of his Indian blood. He mentioned it in his autobiography. When most people see a picture of Coolidge, they don't think of anyone who has Native American blood, but he did. His father, on the other hand, who was over 6 feet tall and had a swarthy complexion and so forth, showed a little bit more of it. Well, let me go on here. His mother was Victoria Josephine Moore Coolidge, a beautiful woman bearing the name of 2 empresses. Coolidge's boyhood in Plymouth Notch was an ordinary one. One of his favorite times of the year was the maple sugar season. Cal, his father said, could get more sap out of a tree than anyone else. Tragedy came early into Coolidge's life. When he was but 12 years old, his mother died. He admitted, "The greatest grief that can come to a boy came to me. Life was never to seem the same again." 5 years later, he would suffer another blow with the death of his sister, Abby. At 13, Calvin Coolidge broke with the past when he entered the Black River Academy at Ludlow, Vermont. It was, he said, his first adventure. "I was perfectly certain," he later wrote, "that I was traveling out of the darkness into the light." He graduated from the academy in May of 1890. In 1891, the 19-year-old Coolidge entered Amherst College. His years there were critical to his intellectual, personal, and career development. It was there that he learned the law of service, under which men are not so solicited about what they shall get as they are about what they shall give. Coolidge would follow its dictates all his life. It would form the basis of his long career of public service. In June of 1895, Coolidge graduated A.B. cum laude. After college, Coolidge moved to Northampton, Massachusetts, a town of 15,000 souls, where in September 1895 he began to read law in the law firm of Hammond and Field. In July of 1897, Coolidge was admitted to the Massachusetts bar, and the following year he opened his own law office. Inspiring confidence and trust, he built a solid reputation, and slowly his practice grew. He was noted for settling his clients' cases out of court, saving them time and money. He willingly helped all who came into him for assistance. His fees were so low that his colleagues in the law upbraided him for not charging more. While still in college, in thinking about his future home, Coolidge had written his father, "I should like to live where I can be of some use to the world, and not simply where I should get a few dollars together." His wish was granted. His new hometown and state would welcome him and lay before him numerous opportunities for public service in the years ahead. In October 1905, he married Grace Goodhue, a teacher at the Clark School there in Northampton. They had 2 children, one of whom, Calvin Jr., died tragically while he was president. The family made their home in a rented duplex. In fact, he would live in that rented duplex even when he came back from the presidency. Calvin Coolidge was born into politics. Indeed, his father was first elected to the Vermont legislature a month after Coolidge's birth. Later, he would attend town meetings with his father and observe how he handled himself and dealt with the issues facing the community. He also experienced democracy at first hand, and in doing so, he gained a lasting respect for the average citizen and the electoral process. For Coolidge, local government and local responsibility were at the very heart of the American democracy. His faith in the people was absolute. When he left Amherst, he commented to a friend, "I am only sure of one thing, that I am a Republican." His republicanism was based firmly in a belief in the correctness of the party's ideals and in its fundamental policies on the great issues of the day, such as the protective tariff. Coolidge would be a loyal party man till the end. This did not, however, prevent him from having friends among the opposition. As for the parties themselves, he believed that that by providing a point of responsibility, they were essential to the functioning of the American political system. I might just toss in a word here about his dealings with the opposition. He got along very well with them, and it's worth noting that perhaps the best obituary or eulogy written for Coolidge at the time of his death was by Al Smith. Hammond and Fields encouraged Coolidge to involve himself in Northampton politics. Although reserved, he had a genuine common touch and enjoyed talking politics with the average citizen, such as James Lucy, a cobbler and a Democrat, with whom Coolidge had become acquainted while in college. Lucy liked the young man, becoming his friend and advisor and helping to introduce him into local politics. Coolidge's first letter from the White House was to Lucy, thanking him for his help. He never forgot his friends and those who made him. That's a very important political quality to have if you're going to be successful. Coolidge began his involvement in politics in the fall of 1895 when he helped Henry P. Field in his race for mayor. The following year, 1896, Coolidge participated in the Great Battle between Bryan and McKinley, writing articles and speaking in support of the gold standard. This was the first election in which he could vote. Up the political ladder, Coolidge was once asked if he had a hobby. He replied, holding office. Over the years, Calvin Coolidge would run for public office 17 times, excluding primaries. This number is high because in Coolidge's day, elections in Massachusetts were held annually. Coolidge, it seems, put himself before the people's judgment more than any other president. He was a first-rate politician and a consistent vote-getter, especially good at attracting Irish Democrat votes. He managed all his early campaigns on his own, and he won each race but one, a seat on the Northampton School Committee in 1905. He was defeated by a man, named, by the way, John Kennedy, but not our John Kennedy, but old John took him down. Anyway, he always ran a positive campaign focusing on the issues. Voters came to see Coolidge as a man of character who knew his business and could be trusted to do the day's work. Moreover, there was never a hint of scandal, personal or political, attached to his name. His great success as a politician was due to his listening to the people and doing what they wanted done. For example, as president, coming into office after the Great War, this would involve restoring the United States to a peacetime basis, or, as Warren Gamaliel Harding so well put it, returning the country to normalcy. His grounding in politics, legislating, and public administration was thorough. He started at the bottom of the political ladder and worked his way to the top. He held both legislative and administrative positions, excelling at both, a rare combination in a politician. In his 23 years in elective office, the following are the 8 positions he held by gift of the people. Northampton City Councilman, 1899, 1 term. Representative to the General Court, 1907, 1908, 2 terms. Mayor of Northampton, 1910, 1911, 2 terms. State Senator, 1912, 1915, 4 terms. Serving as President of the Senate, 1914-15. That was a very important position because at that time a Democrat was governor and he was literally the head of the party in Massachusetts in that position. Lieutenant Governor, 1916-18, 3 terms. Governor of the Commonwealth, 1919-1920, 2 terms. Vice President of the United States, March 4th, 1921 to August 2nd, 1923, when he was called to the presidency upon the death of Warren Harding. That was a partial term, 2 years and 5 months. President of the United States, August the 2nd, 1923 to March the 4th, 1929, elected in his own right on November the 4th, 1924. Partial and one full term, 5 years and 7 months. I'll interrupt here to give you some statistics. In 1924 presidential election, he carried Sedgwick County with 60% of the vote. His two opponents, Davis and LaFollette, I should say, had a combined total of 40% of the vote. So he had 60%. That was a pretty good run. Harding, 4 years prior, had carried the area with 67% of the vote. But anyway, that's the electoral voting in Sedgwick County at that time. Reflections on a politician and statesman. In his political thinking, Coolidge was at heart a conservative. This is seen in the focus on preserving individual liberty and freedom, his defense of property rights, his support of religion, his encouragement of tolerance in a time of intolerance, and his Burkean respect for the law and time-honored institutions and customs of society. When it came to new legislation, he was concerned that it not only be constitutional, but also met a genuine need in a practical fashion. He was never quick to legislate. He was, in fact, more concerned with stopping bad legislation than passing good. Yet he was not afraid to use the powers of government when necessary to address exceptional public need. Coolidge was attuned to the public mood, and he did support progressive or liberal measures during his days in Massachusetts politics. Indeed, early on, he was considered a liberal. He was sympathetic to the cause of women and labor and worked on their behalf. And throughout his career, he was a staunch supporter of education and those who served in that profession. It was while governor of the Commonwealth that Coolidge faced his greatest challenge of his political career, the Boston police strike of 1919, one of those sad, tragic happenings that should never have been. Here he was faced with a challenge that could have either make him politically or destroy his career. Standing firmly for the right as he saw it, he navigated the storm successfully. At the end of it all, he clearly and definitively expressed the issue at the heart of the crisis. Quote, "There is no right to strike against the public safety by anybody, anywhere, anytime," end quote. In these few words, he summed up the nation's mood. President Wilson congratulated him on his firm stand against this, quote, "crime against civilization," end quote. That fall, the voters of the Commonwealth returned Calvin Coolidge to office in a historic landslide victory. Vox populi, vox Dei. As a consequence of the police strike, Coolidge reaped praise and gained national fame that would propel him to the top of the political ladder. At the 1920 Republican Convention, delegates, ignoring the political bosses of the day, enthusiastically chose Coolidge as Warren Harding's running mate. At Harding's passing on August the 2nd, 1923, Calvin Coolidge became president. Asked what thought first came to mind, he replied, "I thought I could swing it." He was famously sworn into office by his father, Colonel John C. Coolidge, a notary public, in the parlor of the family homestead at Plymouth Notch by the light of a kerosene lamp. With his belief in local and state government as the true engine of democracy, Coolidge necessarily held a narrow Jeffersonian view regarding the functions of the national government. Indeed, his view on the subjects were much more in keeping with those of Grover Cleveland, the president of his youth, than with those of Theodore Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson, two notable progressives. As president, he often spoke of the essential, basic role of state and local government in our political system. But frankly, few of his contemporaries paid much attention, for they had learned to love, even in those pre-New Deal days, the dollars flowing into their community from Washington for such popular projects as highway construction. And that was certainly true here in Kansas. I have an incident of that. As president, Coolidge made himself into the nation's chief administrator, de-emphasizing his role as a political leader, like Dwight D. Eisenhower would do later. His primary concern was on reducing the deficit, cutting taxes, and maintaining tariff stability. The latter is rarely ever mentioned, but it was extremely important because that was a subject you didn't want to go off on because it could cause you all kinds of trouble, political trouble, trying to do anything with that tariff. Anyway, he stayed clear of it, as well as making the government run efficiently, effectively, and economically, making every taxpayer dollar sweat. The newly created Bureau of the Budget, which fell under President Coolidge's direct supervision, played a principal role in implementing his program of constructive economy, as he called it. In these tasks, President Coolidge excelled. For example, on his watch, the national debt was reduced from $22.3 billion to $16.9 billion. Tax rates were slashed significantly. The top rate, which at one time was 75%, was only 25% on incomes over $100,000 from 1925 to 1928, and then fell to 24% in 1929. By 1927, with abundant tax revenue flowing in from the well-to-do, 98% of Americans paid no federal taxes at all. Numerous nuisance taxes, such as on cars and theater tickets and ice cream and soda pop and musical instruments and underwear and you name it, they were also eliminated. With much effort, the federal budget was cut 35%, from $5.1 billion in 1921 to $3.3 billion in 1929. He wanted to get it down to $3 billion, but he never succeeded. And that level, by the way, didn't represent any drastic cut from it pretty much put things back to pre-war levels, is what he was aiming at. And he pretty much succeeded there. He didn't drastically cut the civilian branch of the government. Most of the cuts took place in the military side at that time, coming off of the Great War. With pro-business policies in place, the economy boomed, with the industrial production increasing 70%. The real earnings for wagers, real earnings now, growing 22%, and unemployment averaging 3.3%. The stock market, the Coolidge market as it was popularly known, reflecting the prosperity of the day, rose at an annual rate of 22.5%. I don't think that rate has ever been equaled since. Overall, the people had money in their pockets, not just for the necessities of life, but for discretionary spending as well. Indeed, the average working man had never had it so good, and that was certainly true. That was certainly true. Truly, Calvin Coolidge was the right man at the right place at the right time. To build public support for his program of constructive economy, he cleverly and made pioneering use of the new medium of the radio, reporting twice annually to the public on the budget and tax matters. He would do this right at the time that Congress came into session in January back then, and then again around June at the time that the Congress would go away. So he caught them coming in and going out. But these were two major radio addresses that he made consistently throughout his presidency. The radio, which carried most of his major addresses, I think he spoke about 50 times I've been able to calculate. We still don't have a definitive list, but much more than what people normally think. Permitted him to speak directly to the American people over the heads of the politicians and the newspaper editors. It helped him to block or lessen raids on the Treasury, and believe me, with all that money flowing into the Treasury, he had to stand like Horatio at the bridge to stop the looting of that tax dollars for all kinds of boondoggles, as they were there ready to spend it. Coolidge became the first radio president. Coolidge, of course, did not neglect the print media. It became a great source of being a great source of free publicity. He became the first president to hold regular, twice-weekly press conferences. He received generally favorable coverage in the pages of the national newspapers. I think he has something like about 500 news conferences, and those are all recorded. They have transcripts for them, but they're hard to get to because that stuff has never been published or probably made available. He also willingly satisfied the demands of camera and newsreel men who had only recently gained access to the White House. He became the first president to appear in a talk talking newsreel. A man named DeForest did that, and you can go on YouTube today and you can find him there. He's reading from his acceptance speech for the presidency. So if you're interested, go on the YouTube and type in Coolidge and DeForest, and you'll get to see that thrilling speech. He wasn't really very enthusiastic in that one, I have to admit. On the international front, Coolidge believed, as did most of his contemporaries, that the U.S., its hand freely extended in friendship, could best serve the world as a political and economic model. The thinking amongst most people at the time, and I'll give a quote here from Theodore Roosevelt that kind of sums it up. "We, here in America, hold in our hands the hope of the world." And that's what they thought of themselves as. And it was very important to protect our country and our standing, so we would be there as that symbol, that light on, beacon on a hill idea. The administration encouraged a revival of world trade through aiding in the restoration of the international gold standard. This was an extremely complicated and involved task. You have no idea. It involved managing the economy here in the United States and keeping interest rates relatively low to the rest of the world, while on the other hand helping the other countries of the world build up their economies, get their currencies under control, and getting an amount of gold reserves built up and so forth. A very complicated thing. The U.S. sent advisors overseas to assist numerous countries in helping to get their finances in order and restore themselves. The idea that the United States was isolationist in the 20s is a bunch of malarkey and has no validity to it whatsoever. It has supported the reign of international law with support for the World Court. Coolidge supported that, but unfortunately we were never able to get into it because it was blocked by isolationist senators in the Senate, controlled the Foreign Relations Committee. And the ratification, of course, of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. It also worked for the elimination of armaments. Notably, the administration, through the good work of Ambassador Dwight W. Morrill, with some help from Charles Lindbergh, did succeed in restoring our strained relations with Mexico at a time when very powerful interests were pressing for military intervention in that country. That, again, is something that never gets mentioned. There was a tremendous amount of pressure put on Coolidge to try to send U.S. troops into Mexico. The Catholic Church was very much involved in this because of what was being done to the Catholic Church in Mexico. That was certainly understandable. And of course, oil interests were much concerned, and people who owned property. The whole Hearst chain of newspapers was much for intervention in Mexico. So Coolidge had to stand up to the admirals and the generals and the other people who were pushing for this business of intervention. Military training was encouraged. It was Coolidge's thinking that the national debt was the weakest link in the nation's defense because it reduced the funds available to meet military needs in a time of crisis. Thus, his debt reduction program was fundamental to strengthening the nation's military footing. He understood, moreover, that the great strength of the country rested ultimately not in implements of war, but on its people, its agricultural and industrial resources, and its wealth. This led him to focus primarily on issues relating to the mobilization of manpower and industry. Bernard Baruch, who had been much involved in the World War I during these things in the Wilson administration, was a close advisor to Coolidge on such matters. To address these problems of war profiteering and war fortunes, he urged, like President Harding before him, the drafting not just of men, but of wealth and resources in the event of future wars. Now, that's a pretty powerful statement. What he's talking about is going in and really making everyone part of the military effort if there was another war. People had been just outraged by the profiteering that took place during World War I. It was horrible, and both Democrats and Republicans were obsessed with it. I remember seeing a cartoon one time. It shows a line of luxury cars driving down a highway, and the men inside are dressed in suits and top hats and stick pins with diamonds in them, and women in furs and so forth. And on each side of the road there are people, war veterans and orphans and all those people who had suffered in the war. And in the front it said profiteers. And when I saw that, I said, oh, this must be from some socialist publication, The Masses or something like that. And I found out where it appeared. It was in the Saturday Evening Post, George Horace Lullemeyer's Saturday Evening Post, and that was about as middle class as anything you'll ever get. And that shows how much that thinking was at that time about the profiteers. They really were not people that were highly regarded. And Coolidge and Harding spoke out quite firmly against that, making sure that would never happen again. Coolidge did not forget the veteran and their families. Coolidge famously summed up his feelings for the veterans in these words: "The nation that forgets its defenders will itself be forgotten." You perhaps have seen that quote. It's used a lot. Coolidge is quoted all the time. In fact, it's remarkable the number of quotes you get on him, man. The Coolidge presidency, 1923-29, was a most successful one. That was certainly the overwhelming judgment of most of Coolidge's contemporaries. He presided over what was probably the most exciting, vital, and productive decade of the 20th century. Modern America came alive in the 1920s. It was an era marked by peace and unprecedented prosperity, and some would say later that it was the last time that the American people were truly free. As president, Coolidge achieved his major objectives, and this is always important. You pick out your major objectives and work towards those, and he did that. Principally, debt reduction and tax reform, while successfully blocking most of those initiatives he opposed. He enjoyed widespread popularity and could easily have won re-election in 1928, but instead he famously chose not to run again. Personal factors played a role in his decision, as well as a realization that his work was done and that the people and that the public was ready for a new man with a new approach. He remarked to a cabinet member, "I know how to save money. All my training has been in that direction. The country is in sound financial condition. Perhaps the time has come when we ought to spend money. I do not feel that I am qualified to do that." And people would turn, of course, to Herbert Hoover. Moreover, as he wisely observed, it is a pretty good idea to get out when they still want you. And in that, he was certainly wise. On March the 4th, 1929, Calvin Coolidge departed Washington to the plaudits of a public for a job well done. He returned to Northampton, there to live out the time remaining to him. Death came for him on the 5th day of January, 1933. Coolidge was just 60 years old. He never lived to see the coming of the New Deal. He rests today among his ancestors in the cemetery at Plymouth Notch, nestled in the green hills of his beloved Vermont.